Hello, good morning, welcome. This is the last lesson for 2021, and today we are going to be doing water control exercises. And so you're going to need your sketchbook. Prerequisites that I would have is just something that has some texture and that is an actual watercolor paper. It doesn't necessarily have to be 100% cotton, but if you have the budget for it, go for it. You also want to have your number 8 round brush with you, some clean water, clean enough water, and some paint. It really doesn't matter which paints you're using. Here we go. There are many different types of watercolor, but all of them should work two ways. So first off is taking clean water. I'm going to create a clean water square, rectangle shape. Okay, and then take your pigment, paint, and tap it in. This is wet on wet technique, meaning that the paper was already wet and the paint is wet. In this technique, you'll see that the pigment of the paint that you have added does not go outside the area that you've painted with clean water. Let's try that again. So I'm taking quite a bit of water, clean water, onto my brush, and I am carefully but quickly painting a rectangle. And I'm going to pick up some paint on my brush. The consistency of this paint, I would say, is like cream. And I'm going to tap into the area that already has water. So this pigment, even though I'm pushing it right up to the edge, is not going to go over the area that I have put water down on. It's not going to seep over onto the dry edge. It's going to stay within the shape that you created with water. And you can see that you don't have a lot of control over the way that it flows. You can tilt your page and move the pigments around that way. You can move them around within that shape. But the best thing to do is to let the paint do its own magic and just add it to a few areas and let it move around inside that shape. So that is one way to use watercolor paint. Another way is to use wet paint on dry paper. And this is what you would much more likely be familiar with from other methods of painting. This is how we paint with oils and acrylics. We use wet paint and we put it onto a dry surface. So I've done essentially the same thing. I've created a square, but I have a lot more control over where the pigment goes in that shape and the evenness of the layer. Let's try it again. So again, it's quite a thick paint that I'm using, almost opaque. And you can see it's both darker in shade and more even because I've worked quickly and I haven't dipped my brush back in. This is just an even wash, it's called, of paint. What if you want a combination of the two? So I want to control one side. I'm going to come and paint my square the same way that I did with this one. But I'm going to clean my brush off and I'm going to finish the rectangle with clean water. Okay. Now we're getting some interesting shapes. So I've got a little more control on this side and very little control on the other side. This is just a combination of a wet and wet and a dry and wet in a sense, but what this ends up creating is a gradient effect. So you're going from your darkest dark to your lightest light, and I'm just gonna have them touch and let the paint itself move over into the other half of the rectangle, and you're going to have a lot less control over the way that this looks. This one is a nice even application of the paint. This one is going to have evenness on one side and then it will do magic on the other side. So you've got more control, no control really, other than you can create the boundaries of the shape, and some control here. What if you want to do a shadow that blends out into nothing? So what you can do is create your hard edge on one side. Now what I'm going to do is clean off my brush and dry it a little bit. And now I'm going to come back in and I'm just literally wiggling my semi-dry brush around. And I'm creating a soft edge. So I've used my brush almost like a sponge to come over and dry one side. See how it's sucking up some of that pigment? And it's given me more control over this side. By reducing the amount of water, I'm getting a similar effect. I'm getting a gradient. I'm getting a soft edge on this side, but I have more control because I've dried off my brush and I'm reducing the amount of water. Let's do that again. Pick up my paint, create my hard edge. Okay, we're coming about halfway, and then I'm going to clean off my brush. I'm going to dry it off, but I'm not wringing it out, you know, it's a damp brush, okay? And I'm just going to wiggle it around here. I'll do a little wiggle, little wiggle. And I'm going to repeat again because I got a little bit too much paint on my brush. Okay, and I'm wiggling. And I'm getting to white again. So there's I've got more control here. In fact, let me show you. Let's try and even it out. So I have more control here, and this is how I would do a technique for like feathers, for example, to layer feathers, add shadows this way. You've got a little bit more control. Whereas this one, the paint has kind of moved around and it's not as clean of a gradient. Okay. So next I'm going to put my paint down. And I'm going to wet my brush, but not clean it out, just wet the brush. And tap it in. So this is just going to give me a little bit more of a darker gradient. Okay, we haven't gone straight to white. So say for example, what you're trying to do is just show three-dimensional shape by the way that the light hits it. I've added more water on this side, and so it's slightly more diluted, but I still have pigment on my brush. And this side will be slightly lighter than that side, but not to the same extent as this one. So I'm just showing you varying ways to control your pigment and your water at the same time. The other thing that you can do is put down the water, create your shape, and then wait to paint it. Right now, it's literally a puddle. Let's see if I can correct this. It's a puddle of water. I can see it if I tilt my head. I can see it sitting up on top of the page. And if you wait, you know, time it for 10 seconds and then 30 seconds and then a minute, for example. Depending on your climate, because right now I am in a northern hemisphere winter climate, it's typically quite dry because I'm running a heater, but I also have humidifiers in my room, and so right now I'm at about 48% humidity in my space, and so things dry in a reasonable amount of time, but they don't dry too quickly. Depending on what the climate is like in the room that you are painting will change your ability to control the water. Obviously, if you're in an extremely dry environment, your water is going to evaporate more quickly and you're going to have to work more quickly. Whereas where it's about, 50% here, I have a little bit of time to work with this paint. Let's see what happens now that I've chit-chatted. I'm going to put it on this side and I'm going to kind of encourage it to go that way, and we will see what happens. This is kind of more experiment mode, and it really does depend on what pigment you have. Like you can tell, this is a thicker, more opaque, more richly pigmented green than the purple is slightly less. You can see my water itself is starting to get tainted by the pigment. I'm not fussy. If you're fussy and you want it to be a very pure color, definitely you can switch out water. And this is why I personally have like 4 jars of clean water on my desk at any given time. So just make sure that you've got an even layer of coverage on your squares, and see what happens when you allow the water to dry a little bit, to evaporate a little bit. And so instead of painting on a puddle where this is very free flowing, I can move it around, and it's extremely unpredictable. As you paint on less and less wet paint, so another way to do that is to just slightly dry off your brush before you lay it down. So I'm just tapping it on my cloth. You're mimicking drying time. Tap on my cloth. Oh. Okay, so now let's see. This one I'm going to do first. You can see that pigment is not moving as much, is it? Even though I'm kind of flicking it over there, it's spreading out from where I place it. And let's see, in this sort of midway one. So it's moving out from where I place it, but it's not moving as freely as in the really wet petal. So let's see here. My paint itself was quite wet in comparison. It's fun. I'm just, this is play for me now. I hope it's play for you as well. But you can see the difference here in that this first one, which was more of a puddle, you've got less control, it flows around freely, and ultimately you're going to have quite a bit of a drying shift. When I say drying shift, I mean the difference between the color when you initially put it down to when it has dried completely. With watercolor paint, it will get lighter. So you're going to have a more significant drying shift because the pigment is dispersing more freely in the water, versus this will stay a little bit more concentrated because it has not moved as freely. It's still moving in comparison to these ones, but not quite at the same rate as, but not quite at the same rate as the first example. So this would be really fun effect to use to create bushes. You can use it to create things like fur. It's quite a beautiful effect, but again, something that you probably have to test out with your particular pigments, because each one is going to react a little differently to this water. And I just want to show you really quickly that you can use the same technique to create shading and give volume. So to start with, all I have done here is to paint a circle instead of a square. And I'm going to put my paint as if the light is coming this way. I'm going to put my darkest paint on one side of the sphere, and I'm going to let it work its way around to the other side. Clean off my brush, dry it off again, because I don't want to add more moisture into this. I just want to add more pigment. So I've picked up quite a dark, thick, butter-like. See how that's more of a butter-like consistency to drop in on this side. And you'll see that as this dries, it's going to fill out that shape, and you're going to get the effect of a rounded ball. So let's try it again over here. And this is an example of where you want to use this effect, but you do need a little bit more control. So you don't want to have your clean water as a puddle on the page. Instead, you want your page to be evenly damp. And when you look at it from the side, it's glossy. Do you see that? But it's not going to drip anywhere. And I don't want now to take paint that has more water in it than what I've got on the page. So I'm just going to play with this a little bit until I've got a thicker paint on my brush, not too watery, and do the same thing. I'm going to start from this side, and I'm going to let it work its way around the circle. Clean off my brush because I had quite a thick amount of paint on it. Now it's so dry I've squidgied it off. I just want to show you that again. I took my brush and I squeezed it off, okay? And now I'm going to dip back into the puddle, now I'm going to dip back into my paint puddle on my palette, and I'm just going to continue. The reason why I'm doing that is because if I were to take that thick paint again, we wouldn't get the same kind of effect. I want to tease less pigment around here so that ultimately we end up with a shape that is round. So that gives you an idea on how you might use a wet and wet technique, but require a little bit more control of your paint. And I think that is a lot of control. So instead, let me show you how I would do a gradient. So this is one of the first things that I do with my paint. I'm going to try and extend it all the way across to see all the beautiful colors that this can give me. So I'm starting with my creamy consistency, cream to butter consistency, which is going to be the mass tone, meaning the tone that the darkest and deepest value that I can get as if this was right out of the tube. Start there, add water to your brush. Do not try and wring out the brush, you're just adding water. So I'm going to pull that down, add water. The only control I have right now over the pigment is just that I'm diluting it. So I'm adding more water and more water, cover up that until we get to the other side of the page, and it should be going to almost white. Now this particular pigment or paint is very rich. There is a lot of pigment packed into the paint, and so it's going to shoot all the way across to the other side versus something, let me see if I have another one that is a little weaker. So this paint, for example, this one, see how it's not quite as heavily pigmented? So if I were to take this and try and repeat the exercise, it would go white. I mean, I probably wouldn't be able to pull the pigment all the way to the end. Instead, you'd have clean paint on the one side. So we're going to do that again with our green. I'm going to try and get that creamy, buttery consistency that is the mass tone, the darkest that you can get that paint to start with. And dip. And dip. This is really fun. I find this really fun. This is one of those ways that you can just see all the different things that your paint can do. The different variety of color that you can get. And the reason why water control is so important in watercolor is that we preserve the white of the page and use the white of the page to lighten our colors rather than adding white to a pigment to lighten the color. And so this shows you the flexibility of one pigment. As you're diluting it, it gives you many different shades and tints of that particular color. And this one as well, you can now see it's granulating. Granulating is where the paint has different sized pigment granules within it, and so the heavier pigment will fall into the grooves of the page and separate out a little bit, and it gives you very interesting texture. So both of these are granulating paints, and you wouldn't have been able to see it as clearly in a flat wash, for example, as you can here. Now that these have had time to dry, you can really see the difference between the different techniques. So these two are the wet and wet. This is the wet on dry. It's fairly even. This is the gradient that we made, and look at all those nice juicy blooms. This was the hard edge, soft edge. And you can really tell the difference between where I've been able to soften this edge abruptly. And then this was a darker version of this, so adding a darker bloom, but you still got a change in values from one side to the other. And then here's some more of the granulation and gradient that we created. And over here, this is our experiment to see what would happen if we let the paper dry a little bit, and you can see that it has not moved as readily as when it was more wet. So the wetter it is, the more it's going to shoot into that space. And as you let it dry, it will still move around, but not as much into the space. So this is some of the really sketchbooky type of exercises that you can do. Let's see if I can move this here. That you can do with your paint. The sun is coming around now, so I'm going to pause for today. And then tomorrow I'll come back and we can do a fun paint control exercise that you can practice and not really have to think too much and really be happy with the outcome. So I look forward to showing you that.